There is a particular kind of silence that falls over an office when everyone realizes something is about to go wrong. It is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is the sound of keyboards stopping mid-sentence, of chairs creaking as people turn just slightly, of eyes that suddenly find something very interesting to look at on their desks. That silence fell over the 14th floor of Voss Industries on a grey Tuesday morning, the kind of morning nobody remembers until it becomes the morning everybody remembers. Standing at the center of it was a man named Richard Colton, straightening his cufflinks the way he always did before he said something he wanted people to feel. And in front of him, holding a cardboard box she had not yet had time to fill, stood a woman named Emily Hastings, who had done nothing wrong that morning except exist exactly as she was. Richard did not raise his voice. Men like Richard rarely needed to. He simply looked her up and down, the way you might examine something you had found on the bottom of your shoe, and told her, loud enough for the entire floor to hear, that her worn-out shoes and her thrift store blazer were not the image this company wanted to present to its clients. He told her she did not belong in this building. He told her, in front of coworkers who had shared coffee with her that very morning, that she was being let go, effective immediately, and that someone from security would help her find the door if she needed it. Somewhere behind him, a woman covered her mouth. Somewhere else, a man suddenly became very interested in his monitor. Nobody said a word in her defense, because nobody ever does. Not really. Not when the person doing the humiliating signs the checks. What Richard did not expect, what none of them expected, was silence in return. Emily did not argue. She did not cry. She did not even look particularly surprised, which unsettled more people in that room than they would later admit. She simply nodded once, picked up the box that held 3 weeks of borrowed pens and a coffee mug that was not even hers, and walked past him toward the elevator without a single word. Her face gave away nothing, and that nothing would haunt Richard Colton far more than tears ever could have, though he would not understand why for 3 more weeks. Because in exactly 21 days, Richard Colton would be standing in that very same room, in front of that very same staff, and he would be introduced to the new owner of Voss Industries. And it would be her. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Nobody in that building had any reason to suspect what Emily Hastings truly was. To them, she had been a temporary hire, an unremarkable young woman assigned to the administrative pool 3 weeks earlier, answering phones, filing paperwork, and quietly absorbing the rhythms of a company she had never worked inside of before. She kept to herself. She ate lunch alone at her desk, instead of joining the small clusters of gossip that formed near the break room. She wore the same 2 blazers on rotation and the same pair of shoes that had clearly walked more miles than they were built for. And in an office where people measured worth by the label on your bag, that alone was enough to mark her as someone unworthy of real attention. Nobody thought to ask why a temp with no listed employment history for the past 2 years had been placed directly in the department overseeing the company's most sensitive financial reviews. Nobody thought to ask anything at all. They had already decided who she was the moment she walked through the door, and once people decide who you are, they stop looking closely enough to notice they might be wrong. Richard Colton certainly never asked. To him, Emily was simply beneath his notice, a temporary inconvenience assigned to his floor by an HR department he privately considered far too soft for the standards he tried to uphold. He prided himself on running a department that looked the part, that photographed well for client visits, that made Voss Industries appear exactly as polished as the numbers on its quarterly reports suggested it should. A woman in worn shoes did not fit that picture, and so, 3 weeks in, when an important client tour was scheduled and Richard wanted his floor looking its absolute sharpest, Emily Hastings became, in his mind, a problem that needed to be solved before anyone important arrived. He did not know that the woman he was preparing to humiliate in front of an entire office, had spent those same 3 weeks quietly watching everything, every decision, every wasted budget, every moment of unkindness, dressed up as leadership. He did not know that somewhere outside that building, a set of documents was already being finalized, documents that would determine the fate of every person on that floor, including his own. By the time the elevator doors closed behind Emily Hastings that Tuesday morning, carrying her down through 14 floors of a building she had every legal right to already call her own, Richard Colton believed he had simply done his job. He believed he had protected the image of a company he had spent years helping to build. What he did not yet understand, what he could not possibly have understood in that moment, was that the woman he had just humiliated in front of dozens of witnesses was not walking out of Voss Industries. She was walking back into it, on terms none of them could yet imagine. And in exactly 21 days, every person who had stayed silent while she was mocked would be standing in that same room, watching her walk back through those same doors, no longer as a woman they could dismiss, but as the one person in the building whose decision would determine whether any of them still had a job by the end of the week. To understand how a woman humiliated in front of an entire office could return 3 weeks later holding the deed to that very company, you have to understand that nothing about that Tuesday morning was what it appeared to be. Every person on that floor believed they were watching a manager remove an underqualified temp who simply did not fit the image of a respectable firm. What they were actually watching, without knowing it, was the final quiet test of a plan that had been building for months, long before Emily Hastings ever stepped foot inside that building. The real question was never whether she deserved to be there. The real question was why someone with her resources chose to walk through those doors as a nobody instead of announcing herself as the woman who would soon control every paycheck in that room. Because Emily Hastings was not simply an investor reviewing spreadsheets from a distance. She had spent years building a reputation for something rare in her line of work, an insistence on seeing a company the way its own employees experienced it before she ever agreed to put her name behind buying it. That instinct was about to collide directly with a man who had spent his entire career convinced that appearances told you everything you needed to know about a person's worth. Richard Colton believed he was protecting his department's image. He had no idea he was auditioning for the very people deciding whether he would still have a department to protect at all. Somewhere in that collision between his certainty and her patience, a much larger story about what companies value and what they overlook was quietly taking shape. There is also the matter of Daniel Voss, the aging founder whose name still hung above the lobby doors, a man who had spent the last several years growing increasingly uneasy about who his company had become under executives who cared more about optics than the people generating the actual results. Daniel had questions of his own, long before Emily ever arrived. Questions about loyalty, about who could be trusted with something he had spent 30 years building. What he did not yet know was that the answer to those questions had been quietly filing paperwork in his administrative pool for 3 weeks, watching everything, saying almost nothing, and drawing conclusions that would soon determine his company's entire future. Whether Daniel would trust what she found, and whether Richard Colton would survive the reckoning coming for him, were questions the next 21 days were about to answer in full. Emily Hastings grew up in a small town in Ohio, where the winters lasted longer than anyone's patience, and where her mother worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on through those winters. There was no inheritance waiting for her, no family name that opened doors, no safety net stretched beneath her in case she fell. What she had instead was a mother who came home every night smelling like a diner kitchen and still found the energy to sit with her at the table and check her homework, insisting that an education was the one thing nobody could ever take away from her. Emily watched that woman work herself thin for years without complaint, and somewhere in those long nights at the kitchen table, she made a quiet promise to herself that she would build a life sturdy enough that no one could ever look at her the way people looked at her mother, as though hard work made a person invisible instead of admirable. She put herself through community college working nights at a call center, transferred to a state university on a partial scholarship, and graduated with a finance degree and almost nothing else. No connections, no cushion, no room for a single misstep. Her first job out of college paid barely enough to cover rent on a studio apartment above a laundromat, but she treated every spreadsheet like it mattered, because to her it did. She spent her 20s learning the unglamorous mechanics of small investment funds, the kind of work that never makes headlines but slowly teaches a person how businesses actually rise or fall from the inside. By the time she was in her 30s, Emily had quietly built a modest fund of her own, one built on a simple, almost old-fashioned belief that a company was only ever as strong as how it treated the people nobody thought to notice. That belief was about to be tested at Voss Industries, a company whose founder, Daniel Voss, had built something real from almost nothing decades earlier, back when the name above the door still meant something more than a logo on a letterhead. Daniel had grown the company from a single warehouse into a respected regional name through decades of stubborn, hands-on work, the kind where he knew half his employees by their first names and the names of their kids. But in recent years, as he neared retirement with no children of his own to hand the company to, he had watched with a growing unease as the culture beneath him shifted, as executives like Richard Colton rose through the ranks, prioritizing polish over substance, image over integrity. Daniel had begun quietly searching for someone he could trust with what he had built, though he could not have guessed that the answer to his search was about to walk through his own front doors, unannounced, in a second-hand blazer and a pair of worn-out shoes. The arrangement that brought Emily into that building was simple on paper and delicate in practice. Her fund had entered late-stage discussions to acquire a controlling stake in Voss Industries, and rather than rely solely on financial reports and polished boardroom presentations, Emily insisted on something her partners considered unusual: spending real time inside a company before deciding whether to trust it with her investors' money and her own reputation. She had done this before, quietly, on a smaller scale, and it had never once failed to reveal something the paperwork could not. So she arranged, with only her closest partner aware of the details, to spend 3 unpaid, unofficial weeks working as a temporary administrative hire inside the very department she was preparing to help acquire, watching how decisions were really made and how the people at the bottom were really treated when no one important was thought to be paying attention. On her first morning at Voss Industries, Emily arrived early, found her assigned desk in the administrative pool, and began quietly learning the rhythms of a building that had no idea who had just walked through its doors. She answered phones. She filed paperwork. She kept careful, private notes on things that mattered far more than her formal task list, the way budgets were quietly padded before executive reviews, the way certain employees were praised only when clients were watching, the small, unkind comments dropped so casually that most people in that office had long since stopped noticing them at all. Richard Colton barely registered her presence those first 2 weeks, dismissing her as unremarkable in the exact way that would soon prove to be his most costly mistake, because Emily Hastings had spent her entire life being underestimated by people who never once imagined what she was quietly capable of building. By her 3rd week at Voss Industries, Emily Hastings had settled into a rhythm nobody thought twice about. She arrived early, answered phones with the same patient tone no matter how rude the caller, and filed paperwork with a precision that a few sharper eyes might have found unusual for someone supposedly just passing through an administrative pool. What those sharper eyes never noticed was how carefully she was watching everything around her, how she quietly clocked which numbers on Richard Colton's weekly reports never quite matched the ones buried in the raw data she was asked to file. She said nothing. She corrected nothing. She simply kept a private record, understanding that the real value of this experiment was not in catching a single mistake, but in seeing the pattern of a culture that had slowly stopped asking hard questions of the people at the top. Richard Colton, meanwhile, was preparing for something he considered far more important than any temp's filing habits. A major client, one of the largest accounts still on Voss Industries' books, had scheduled an in-person tour of the department, and Richard intended for that tour to reflect the image he had spent years cultivating. Sharp suits, confident handshakes, a floor that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread rather than a working office. He walked the department twice that week, adjusting name placards, reminding people to keep their desks clear, dropping comments about presentation that made more than one employee quietly roll their eyes once his back was turned. Emily watched this ritual unfold with the same calm patience she brought to everything else, though something in the tightening of Richard's jaw each time he passed her desk suggested he had already decided she did not belong in his carefully staged picture. The morning of the client visit arrived with the particular tension that settles over an office when everyone senses a performance is about to begin. Richard moved through the floor giving last-minute instructions, his voice carrying just enough edge that people straightened without being asked twice. When he reached Emily's desk, he paused longer than he had all week, his eyes moving deliberately from her scuffed shoes up to the same second-hand blazer she had worn nearly every day since she arrived. He said nothing to her directly, not yet, but the look on his face was the look of a man doing arithmetic, deciding what she cost him in a room full of people whose opinions he cared about far more than hers. He walked away without a word, and for the first time in 3 weeks, Emily felt the shift in the air around her, though her expression never changed. An hour before the client was scheduled to arrive, Richard called an impromptu floor meeting, the kind of gathering that instantly tells everyone in the room something uncomfortable is coming. He stood at the center of the department, straightened his cufflinks in the habit everyone had come to recognize, and began speaking about the importance of professionalism, about how every single person on this floor represented the Voss Industries brand, whether they liked it or not. His eyes drifted toward Emily as he spoke, lingering just long enough that a few coworkers glanced her way as well, uncertain where this was heading but sensing, correctly, that it was heading somewhere it should not. The room grew quieter with every sentence, the particular silence of people who suspect they are about to witness something they will not be proud of themselves for staying silent through. Then Richard said her name, and the room went still, in the way rooms go still, right before something breaks. He told Emily, in front of every coworker who had shared coffee and small talk with her for 3 weeks, that her appearance did not reflect the standard he expected on this floor, that her worn shoes and her thrift store blazer were not the image Voss Industries wanted to present to a client of this caliber. He told her she was being let go, effective immediately, his voice calm and almost bored, as though he were discussing a printer that needed replacing, rather than a person standing 3 feet in front of him. Somewhere behind him, a coworker's mouth fell open. Somewhere else, someone suddenly needed to check their phone. Nobody said a single word in her defense, and the silence in that room would follow every one of them long after that morning ended. Emily did not argue, did not raise her voice, did not give Richard the reaction his cruelty seemed almost hungry for. She simply nodded once, gathered the small handful of items from her desk into a cardboard box that had clearly once held printer paper, and walked the length of that silent office toward the elevator without looking back. Her calm, unsettled people, more than tears ever could have, though none of them could have said exactly why in that moment. What none of them saw, what only she knew as the elevator doors closed behind her, was that a black car was already waiting at the curb outside, and that the man behind the wheel, her partner Martin Cho, had a single message waiting for her the second she climbed inside. The acquisition of Voss Industries had just cleared its final approval. In 3 weeks, she would be walking back through those doors, and this time, no one in that building would be deciding whether she belonged. In the days that followed, Richard Colton told anyone who would listen that he had made the right call. He repeated the story at lunch, in the elevator, in passing conversations with other managers, always landing on the same conclusion, that a department representing a company like Voss Industries could not afford to look anything less than polished in front of major clients. A few coworkers nodded along out of habit, the way people often agree with someone in power simply to avoid becoming his next example. Others said nothing at all, privately uneasy about what they had watched happen, but unwilling to risk their own position by voicing it. Nobody mentioned Emily's name again after that first day, and within a week, her 3 weeks on that floor had already begun to fade into the kind of forgettable footnote most people assumed she would remain. Emily, meanwhile, was back in the world she actually belonged to, sitting across a conference table from her partner Martin Cho, reviewing the final documents that would transfer controlling ownership of Voss Industries into her fund's hands within days. She read through personnel structures, department budgets, and client contracts with the same careful attention she had brought to filing paperwork on that administrative floor, except now there was nothing hidden from her, no need to watch quietly from the sidelines. Martin asked her, more than once, whether she wanted to reconsider how the transition would be announced, whether a more traditional handoff might spare her the discomfort of walking back into a building that had just humiliated her. Emily told him plainly that discomfort was never the point. She needed to see the truth of that company before deciding what to do with it, and now she had seen more than enough. The first person to learn the full truth, beyond Emily's own team, was Daniel Voss himself. He arrived at the meeting expecting to shake hands with an investment fund's lead representative, a formality he had prepared for the way he prepared for every major decision late in his career, carefully and a little wearily. When Emily walked into the room, he recognized her immediately, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, simply studying her face as the pieces rearranged themselves into a shape he had not expected. He asked her, quietly, whether this was some form of retribution dressed up as a business deal, whether she had engineered her own humiliation just to justify what was coming next for the people who worked beneath him. Emily answered him honestly. She had not planned to be fired. She had only wanted to see his company as it truly was, and Richard Colton had shown her exactly that, without ever needing to be asked. Daniel sat with that answer longer than he sat with most decisions. He had spent 30 years building something he believed in, and the idea that its current culture could produce a scene like the one Emily described, a woman dismissed in front of an entire floor over the condition of her shoes, troubled him more than any spreadsheet ever could. He asked her what she intended to do once the deal closed, and Emily told him she had no interest in a public spectacle or a dramatic reckoning for its own sake. She wanted to understand who deserved to stay, who deserved a second look, and who had built their entire position on assumptions about people they had never bothered to actually see. Daniel nodded slowly, and for the first time since he had begun searching for someone to trust with his company's future, he allowed himself to believe he might have finally found her. Back inside Voss Industries, unaware of any of this, Laura Pierce found herself thinking about Emily more than she expected to. She had barely known the woman, exchanging little more than polite hallway conversation during those 3 weeks, but something about the way Richard had spoken to her that morning had settled uneasily in Laura's chest ever since. On a quiet afternoon, acting on nothing more than a nagging sense of guilt, Laura tracked down a contact number from the temp agency's records and sent Emily a brief, careful message, apologizing for not speaking up when it mattered and hoping she had landed somewhere better than the way she had been treated here. Emily read that message twice before responding, recognizing in it something rare inside that building, a person willing to admit discomfort with what she had witnessed rather than simply looking away. It was a small gesture, and Emily did not forget it. By the following week, quiet rumors had begun moving through the halls of Voss Industries, the kind of rumors that spread fastest precisely because no one in leadership will confirm or deny them. Someone in accounting had heard whispers about a change in ownership. Someone in legal had noticed unfamiliar names appearing on documents routed through the executive floor. Richard Colton dismissed the speculation whenever it reached him, confident that whatever shift was coming would only strengthen his position, certain that a man who ran as tight a department as his had nothing to fear from new ownership. He had no idea that an all-staff meeting had already been scheduled for the following Monday morning. No explanation attached, no agenda released in advance, only a company-wide calendar invite that left every single employee on that floor, Richard included, wondering exactly what was about to walk through those doors. Monday morning arrived at Voss Industries wrapped in the particular tension of a building full of people who all sense something is coming but cannot agree on what. The calendar invite had offered nothing beyond a time and a location, the main conference floor, mandatory attendance, no further details, and in the absence of information, every possible rumor had found room to grow. Some whispered about layoffs, some whispered about a merger. Richard Colton walked in that morning wearing his sharpest suit, the one he saved for occasions where he wanted to be remembered, quietly confident that whatever change was coming would only elevate a manager who ran as disciplined a floor as his. He found a seat near the front, close enough to be noticed, and waited with the easy posture of a man who had never once considered that this meeting might not be about him in the way he assumed. Daniel Voss stepped up first, and the room settled into silence, the way rooms always did for him, a silence built on genuine respect rather than fear. He thanked everyone for their patience over the past several days, acknowledged the swirl of rumors he knew had been circulating, and then, without further preamble, confirmed what many had already suspected, that Voss Industries had entered a new chapter under new ownership. He spoke briefly about the fund behind the acquisition, about its reputation for careful, people-first evaluation before any deal was finalized, and about his own confidence that the company he had built from a single warehouse decades earlier was finally landing in hands he trusted completely. Richard listened with growing anticipation, already imagining which introduction might come next, already rehearsing the confident handshake he planned to offer whoever walked through that door. Then the doors at the back of the conference floor opened, and Emily Hastings walked in. She wore the same worn shoes. She wore the same second-hand blazer she had worn nearly every day during her 3 weeks, in that very building, the same one Richard Colton had stood in front of an entire office and dismissed as unworthy of representing this company. A ripple moved through the room as recognition spread from face to face, coworkers turning toward each other in confused, half-whispered disbelief, trying to reconcile the temp they remembered filing paperwork in the administrative pool with the woman now walking calmly toward the front of the room beside Daniel Voss himself. Richard Colton's confident posture did not change at first, not immediately, as though some part of him refused to process what his eyes were already telling him. It was only when Daniel turned to the room and introduced her, not as a guest, not as a consultant, but as the new majority owner and incoming chair of Voss Industries, that the color began draining from Richard's face in real time. For a long moment, Richard said nothing, and in the strange stillness of that conference room, dozens of co-workers who had stayed silent during Emily's firing found themselves reliving that morning all over again, this time from a very different angle. They remembered the cardboard box. They remembered the calm, unreadable look on her face as she walked past every one of them toward the elevator. They remembered their own silence and how easy it had been to look away rather than say a single word in her defense. Emily did not raise her voice or draw attention to the irony of the moment, though everyone in that room understood it without needing to be told. She simply thanked Daniel for the introduction, thanked the staff for their patience during the transition, and addressed the room with the same calm, measured tone she had carried through every hour of her 3 weeks there, a tone that made the silence around her feel even heavier than shouting would have. She told them plainly what she had learned during her time on that floor, not as an accusation aimed at any single person, but as an honest account of what she had witnessed. She had seen good people doing careful, honest work every single day, work that too often went unnoticed by leadership, more concerned with appearances than substance. She had also seen a culture where kindness toward the people at the bottom was treated as optional, where a person's worth was measured by the condition of their shoes rather than the quality of their work, and where far too many people had learned it was safer to stay silent than to speak up when they saw someone being treated unfairly. She did not look at Richard Colton as she said this, though she did not need to. Every single person in that room understood exactly who she was describing, and exactly who was sitting frozen in his chair near the front, still processing the fact that the woman he had humiliated now controlled every decision about his future at this company. Word of what happened in that conference room spread through Voss Industries within the hour, moving faster than any official announcement could have traveled. By lunchtime, nearly everyone in the building had heard some version of the story. The temp who had been fired for wearing worn shoes was now the majority owner standing at the head of the company, and Richard Colton had been sitting close enough to shake her hand the day he humiliated her. Most people expected what typically follows a story like that, a swift and very public reckoning, the kind of dramatic ending that would give the entire office something to quietly celebrate around the break room later that week. Richard himself seemed to expect it too, spending the rest of that Monday moving through the building like a man waiting for the other shoe to fall, avoiding eye contact, keeping his office door closed longer than usual. But Emily had never been interested in spectacle, not because Richard did not deserve consequences, but because she understood something many people in his position rarely learned in time, that public humiliation rarely changes a person. It simply teaches them to hide the same instincts more carefully next time. 2 days after the announcement, she requested a private meeting with Richard, just the two of them. No audience, no witnesses, nothing that would let him perform contrition the way he had once performed authority in front of an entire floor. When he sat down across from her, visibly bracing for the conversation he assumed would end his career at Voss Industries, Emily simply asked him to tell her, honestly, why he believed her shoes had mattered more that morning than the quality of the work she had quietly done for 3 weeks. Richard struggled to answer her, which told Emily more than any polished response could have. He offered explanations about client expectations and professional standards, the same language he had used for years to justify decisions that, when spoken aloud in a quiet room instead of shouted across an office, sounded thinner than he seemed to realize himself. Emily listened without interrupting, and when he finally ran out of things to say, she offered him something he had not expected, a choice rather than a verdict. He could step down from his management position entirely, or he could remain with the company on the condition that he spend the next several months working directly on the floor, doing the same frontline work as the employees he had spent years managing from a comfortable distance, answering phones, filing paperwork, learning firsthand what it actually felt like to be judged by people who had never bothered to see him clearly either. Richard sat with that offer for a long moment, and something in his posture shifted, the careful armor of confidence he wore, like a second suit finally cracking just slightly. He asked her why she would offer him anything at all after what he had done, and Emily told him the truth, that she had built her entire career on refusing to believe people were only ever the worst version of themselves in a single moment, even when that moment had cost her something real. Whether he chose to grow from this or not would be entirely up to him. But she was not interested in becoming the very thing she had spent her life resisting. Someone who dismissed a person's worth based on nothing more than a single impression. Richard did not answer immediately. He simply nodded, quietly, and for the first time since she had met him, he looked like a man actually listening. In the weeks that followed, the changes at Voss Industries extended well beyond Richard's private reckoning. Laura Pierce, whose quiet apology had reached Emily during the darkest days of the transition, was promoted into a newly created role overseeing culture and employee relations across the company. A decision Emily made not as a reward for guilt, but as recognition of the rare decency Laura had shown when she had absolutely nothing to gain from showing it. Daniel Voss stayed on for several more months in an advisory role, watching with quiet satisfaction as the company he had built slowly began reflecting the values he had always hoped it would hold, even if it had taken someone entirely unexpected to help it find its way back there. Late one evening, long after the office had emptied out, Emily sat alone in what was now her office, looking out over a floor that had once dismissed her without a second thought. She thought of her mother, of diner shifts and worn shoes, and a promise made across a kitchen table years before any of this began, and she understood, more clearly than ever, that the real measure of everything she had built was never going to be the size of the deal or the title on her door. It was this quiet moment, knowing that somewhere in that building, people were finally being seen for who they actually were, rather than what they appeared to be. The question she carried with her, the one she hoped every viewer watching this story would carry with them too, was simple. How many people had they misjudged themselves, simply because of what someone happened to be wearing, rather than who they truly were underneath it? Somewhere out there tonight, in an office you might recognize, someone is being measured by the same shallow standard Richard Colton once used against Emily Hastings, judged not by the quality of their work or the strength of their character, but by something as simple and as meaningless as the condition of their shoes or the label on their jacket. Most of the time, the story ends exactly the way everyone expects it to, quietly, without consequence. The person who judged unfairly never learning they were wrong, and the person judged simply moving on to somewhere else, carrying that small, unfair moment with them longer than anyone realizes. Emily Hastings' story stayed with so many people not because of the size of the company she ended up owning, but because of how rare it is for a moment like that to ever come back around at all. We want to know what you think. Would you have recognized what Emily was truly capable of before the truth came out? Or would you have looked at those worn shoes and made the same assumption everyone else in that office made, without a second thought? Tell us in the comments where you're watching this story from tonight, because we genuinely love hearing from every single one of you. And if there is a moment in your own life where you were misjudged, or maybe a moment where you misjudged someone else, we would love to hear that story too. This is exactly the kind of quiet, character-driven reckoning we build these videos around. Ordinary people revealing extraordinary depth in the moments others least expect it. And if this story pulled you in the way we hope it